I'm Lila Corwin-Berman. I'm a professor of history and the director of the Feinstein Center for American Jewish History at Temple University. And I'm really delighted to be the co-conceiver and I guess co-convener of the Jewish Philanthropy Research Initiative with my colleague, Steve Weitzman, who is here, but will be mainly, I think, a silent and invisible member of our group today. But he's neither silent nor invisible in the work of putting together the Jewish Philanthropy Research Initiative. Steve teaches at Penn, and he directs Penn's Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, and together Penn and Temple have worked on the Jewish Philanthropy Research Initiative. And our work began really in 2019 when we started with a small workshop about Jewish philanthropy and the kind of basic idea of trying to stimulate scholarly and broad conversation about the multiple histories, texts, and traditions of Jewish philanthropy. Growing out of that, and really since the pandemic, our programs have taken a virtual turn. And the program today is the final program of this year's series. The series this year has focused on the public and private politics of philanthropy, new insights into the past, present, and future of giving. We're extraordinarily grateful to the Lippman Cantor Foundation for Living Torah for also providing support for this. And please do stay tuned. We're going to announce our plans for next year before too long, and frankly, after we figure them all out. But in the meantime, it really gives me so much pleasure today to introduce a program that's been really important to me to plan and to think about, covering Jewish philanthropy, the role of the press. I think the topic is extraordinarily important as we think about how we know what we know or what we don't know about Jewish philanthropy. And I am particularly excited that Stacy Palmer has agreed to moderate the program. She really knows more about reporting on Jewish philanthropy than anyone I can think of. In a moment, I'm going to introduce her and really turn the program over to her. But I do want to let you know that your questions matter to us, and we're going to be looking at your questions. So please use the Q&A function. You can use it throughout the program to pose your questions, and we'll be looking at them. The first 30 to 40 minutes of our program will really be a conversation among our panelists. And after that, we'll really turn to those questions that you pose. So let me introduce Stacy, and then I'm going to turn things over to her. Stacy has served as a top editor since the Chronicle of Philanthropy was founded in 1988. She's also the editor of a volume called Challenges for Philanthropy and Nonprofits that came out in 2004, and that collects 3 decades of observations by nonprofit activists. And before that, she actually helped found the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and she was also an editor for government and politics at the Chronicle of Higher Education. So I'm really delighted, Stacy, to have you here to moderate this conversation, and you'll take it from here, and the others will pop up and introduce themselves. Thank you so much. I think you're muted, Stacy.
My apologies. Thank you, Lila and Steve, for organizing such a timely conversation. And thanks to all of you for gathering here. As Lila said, we really want your questions. We want this to be interactive, so please keep posing them as you have them. We have a terrific panel assembled today, and they really cover things from a lot of different perspectives and have wide experience, which I'd love you to hear about in their own words. So I'm going to start with Asaf.
Hi, everyone. I'm Asaf Shalev. I am a reporter based in Los Angeles. I do investigative reporting for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. And for those who aren't familiar with what that is, we're a wire service, kind of like the Associated Press. We've been around for more than 100 years. And traditionally, our mission has been to provide Jewish newspapers all over the world with news reporting. And in the digital age, we still do that, but we also are our own platform for distributing news and on social media and everywhere else. for the past 2 years since I joined JTA, I've been on the philanthropy beat, and my job is to figure out what is the flow of money, the how decisions are made, and what impact philanthropy is having on the community. And yeah, I think that sums it up.
That's terrific. We'll hear. Thanks so much. We'll hear more from you very soon. I'd like to turn to your colleague, Ben Sales. Can you talk about your background?
Hi, thanks so much for having me on this panel and for organizing this. My name is Ben Sales. I am currently, as of about a month ago, the news editor of JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which Asaf gave a very thorough explanation of just now. For a year before that, I was the news editor of a publication called E-Jewish Philanthropy, which, as you might be able to tell by the name, covers the world of Jewish philanthropy. And I was the first person in that particular position for about 15 years. The publication EJP was founded about 15 years ago. And for the vast majority of that time, it served as a platform for opinion writing and thought leadership from people in the world of Jewish philanthropy. So people from foundations, from Jewish organizations and nonprofits. And then a couple of years ago, it was acquired by a publication called Jewish Insider, which kind of covers Jewish politics and that world. And it started a news section to cover the Jewish philanthropic space from a news perspective, to write news about that world. And that's why I was brought in, and that's what I did for a year. So that involves curating a newsletter and kind of more to the point, involved really covering the day-to-day news of where money was going, what the trends were, who the recipients were, what the big grants and initiatives were. And so that really gave me a pretty intimate familiarity with the mechanics of that world. And I'm really excited to be back at JTA, where I was a reporter for a decade before I moved briefly to EJP. So I'm really excited to be back at JTA and working with Asaf and our whole team to do really deep reporting on these issues and much more.
Terrific. Such important work that you're doing. Mari, let's hear about your background.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Mari Cohen, and I am Associate Editor at Jewish Currents. Jewish Currents is a progressive Jewish magazine, and my role involves both editing and reporting and writing. And my reporting beat tends to focus on American Jewish institutions and their politics. And so in the course of that work, I often tend to encounter stories about Jewish philanthropy, since the way that our institutions operate and act is influenced by philanthropy. And so a lot of those questions come to be very relevant. I especially tend to focus on long form reporting, and some of my recent stories, for example, have focused on the development of Israel studies as an academic discipline, especially in the United States, which was heavily influenced by a philanthropic effort to create the discipline, which also had caused a lot of controversy. So that's an example of a story, that type of story that I work on, that tends to engage with questions around Jewish philanthropy. And recently I also wrote about kind of questions around Jewish involvement in socially responsible investing, where controversies tend to come up around efforts to divest from Israel-Palestine, and lots of controversies around that. And it's a big question for Jewish philanthropy, given that there's questions about where philanthropists are putting their investments. So those are some of the things that I've worked on, and I'm really excited to get to be part of this discussion and hear from the excellent other reporters on the panel about their work.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you all for giving us some more background so that we can know more about you and what you're coming from. You all touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could talk about just how do you think about Jewish philanthropy? What does that mean? And how do you define your coverage areas? I will say at the Chronicle of Philanthropy, we take a very broad view of the world of nonprofits and foundations and donors. And we're talking about volunteerism, money, the people who work at the organizations. But I'm curious how you think about it all. And Mari, could I start with you?
Sure. I think one thing that kind of helps me in terms of approaching Jewish philanthropy is that I try not to think of it as something entirely separate from the world of philanthropy more broadly, because I really think these issues are issues that face a lot of communities and that are relevant to like American politics and the world of American, finance and everything more generally. The ways in which Jewish philanthropy operates is under the same policies and structures that philanthropy more generally operates. So I think that's kind of a guiding principle for me. That being said, obviously there is, a rich and specific history of how Jewish philanthropy has operated. There's communal structures that, federations, donor-advised funds that provide opportunities for Jewish philanthropy more specifically. So I think it's very helpful to know and engage with that history. In terms of, how broad of a view to take, I think there is this question, are we talking about larger donors? Are we talking about, small donors and community fundraising and more broad popular fundraising efforts? I think it definitely makes sense to think about all of those things in terms of philanthropy. I think when we're talking about journalism, often it's a helpful guiding principle to turn towards where we're looking at power and how power is operating and, who's able to enact the most power, and often that comes when money is more concentrated. And so I think some of the big donors and big philanthropists and foundations tend to come up in our work more often because they're often making more of the big moves at the top. But I don't think that means we should neglect or forget about other efforts, but that it's just always useful to have an eye towards where structures of power are operating and where that's concentrated.
I'm so glad you raised that, because that is one of the most important reasons the press needs to cover philanthropy. And I think its failure to do such a wonderful job is that they don't talk about those power structures and how money moves. So I'm glad all of you are dedicated to that. Ben, how would you answer that question?
So I would second a lot of what Mari said. I think when I think about like what counts as Jewish philanthropy, and especially when I was at Jewish Philanthropy, like the core of the work and the coverage had to do with foundations and organizations that had Judaism or Jewish causes as part of their missions, right? So foundations will have principles that guide where they give their money and how they give their money, there are a lot of foundations that explicitly talk about Jewish causes in those principles, and so that's where our focus was. But we would also cover big philanthropists who are Jewish, right? So like Michael Bloomberg is an example of this, right? So like I went to the Bloomberg Climate Conference and covered that, and his work and others like him would intersect with Jewish causes in Israel every so often. But during the time I was there, and of course it was brief, but like during that time, I also tried to like shift my focus. Again, kind of cribbing off what Mari said, like that I wasn't only thinking about philanthropy, but also how people are using money for impact, right, in Jewish spaces and towards Jewish ends, however you define that, right? So that absolutely includes impact investing and ESG and things like that.
Right. Asaf, what would you add to that?
Yeah, all I'd want to add, I agree with so much what you said, and all I'd add is journalists outside of the Jewish world, when they are looking at structures of power and trying to figure out the world, they tend to focus on government and maybe on business. And I think the existence of the Chronicle of Philanthropy is a testimony to like how they don't focus perhaps enough on philanthropy, and that's a really important part of the power structure. In the Jewish world itself, if you want to look at how it's organized, government is an important part of that, and business, but really the community is organized through philanthropy. That is the structure. All our institutions are charitable institutions, or all 501c3s or other kind of legal structures similar to that. And so if you want to hold power accountable in the Jewish world, you have to focus on philanthropy. So that's really the main kind of thing I'd add in terms of how broadly we might think about it. I think there's a lot of opportunity in thinking broadly about what is philanthropy. For example, last year, maybe a year and a half ago, Michael Steinhardt, a very, very big Jewish philanthropist, got in trouble. He previously got in trouble for sexual harassment allegations, but this time around, he got in trouble over his collection of antiquities, which were found to be mostly stolen. And he denies that he knew they were stolen, but they were indeed looted. And that itself would have been a significant story for us, a major Jewish figure getting in legal trouble. But what I found when I looked at it from a philanthropy angle was that I focused on one particular ancient artifact that had been looted from Israel. And it was looted from this one cave, and he ended up in New York with Michael Steinhardt. Well, it turns out from my reporting that same cave is a cave that his philanthropic dollars have helped preserve. He founded Birthright, and the Birthright program that sends Jews on trips to Israel. And part of what the program does is bring visitors to this very, very exact cave where the antiquity was found. And so that money helps preserve this whole archaeological complex. So it's just you get a much more complicated story than just he's a bad guy or a guy who likes looted antiquities. He's also at the same time he's getting a lot of credit for preserving these antiquities. So you have to find the meaning in that, and I'll let readers kind of decide what it all means, or I'll quote people like Professor Lila Cohen Berman to give meaning to that.
Yes, we rely on experts like that for sure. I was wondering, when you mentioned Steinhardt, can you talk about, all of you, how do you feel the rest of the press, the mainstream press, how does it cover Jewish philanthropy? Enough, not with depth, not with nuance? What do you see when you look out and see the sort of general press coverage, which let's just say is probably fairly limited, but I'm curious what you think of it when you read the New York Times or other places like that. Who wants to start with the answer to that question?
I'm happy to answer that. I think this is something that is a question that is not just limited to Jewish philanthropy, but also how, the regular press covers Jewish issues, because obviously those things are quite related. And it's something we think about a lot at Jewish Currents in terms of when we think about, what the focus is of our work and why it's important for us to cover these things, both for a Jewish audience and a more general audience. And I think with philanthropy, these aspects often become underscored. I think that the press tends to be quite squeamish about covering these kinds of Jewish issues. I think one of the things is the history of anti-Semitic tropes around Jews and money. And I think that rightfully there is concern about not playing into those tropes, which is good and something that people should be caring about, but not to the extent that they should turn away from any stories covering these sorts of things. And instead, I think it is the role of journalists to try to engage with some complicated issues and figure out how to walk the line of reporting accurately about Jewish philanthropy without playing into difficult tropes. And I don't think that's too much for us to ask of them. So I definitely think that that's something that keeps mainstream reporters turned away. I also think in general, it just is considered kind of a niche issue. It's considered an issue of a small religious and ethnic community in the United States, and it's not considered a general interest topic. And I think that's true of Jewish institutions and politics generally, and of philanthropy. And often reporters aren't really trained in this as a beat unless they're working for specific publications like JTA or like Jewish Currents, Forward. And I think it's a problem because that's not really true, because these institutions and philanthropies and efforts really affect all of American politics. If we think about, for example, the role of AIPAC in elections, and donors to AIPAC, those interventions affect politics for everybody. If we think about even some of the stuff that my colleagues and I have worked on have to do with legislation, making BDS and boycotts of Israel, penalizing that at the state level. And that legislation becomes replicated and copied to, limit boycotts of other issues, including around abortion access, guns, oil. And so these issues really are relevant for everybody, and they're all connected the same way that, you know, issues affecting other communities are affected to the relevant to the Jewish community. So I think that seeing it as a niche issue is a mistake, and it's something that, you know, I'm glad that we have, you know, the Jewish press able to step in on, but that it would be great to see the mainstream press step up. And to give credit where credit is due, it's not always the case. For example, I think it was the New York Times that did break the story about Steinhardt's sexual harassment allegations. And so obviously sometimes they do get in on these stories, but I think that it's not often enough.
So yeah, I think that's true. I will note that I think the Steinhardt story first appeared in the Jewish Week, and then there was an expansion of that in the New York Times, for sure. But something I was going to say is that, you know, a big example. I think Mari's right that, like, you know, the vast majority of the deep work on this is in Jewish papers by reporters like my colleagues on this panel, you know, an exception to that is the New York Times investigation into Hasidic schools, which certainly touches on philanthropy and where nonprofit dollars are being used. But I mean, I think,
could you talk a little bit about that for people who might not have read that series?
Oh, sure. I mean, you know, it's there's a lot of discourse around it, and I don't want to be the one to authoritatively summarize it, but the New York Times has done an investigative series both on educational standards and standards of behavior and treatment of students in Hasidic private schools in the New York area, and that later installments, more recent installments of the series, have touched on the way government funding is going to special needs education in those schools and things like that. And again, there's been a lot of opposition from that community to the reporting, and a lot of investigative reporting in what's going on at those schools. But I mean, that's just an example of a time when, and another example like the Steinhardt stuff, when the mainstream press is covering these issues. New York Magazine just had a story on the Steinhardt antiquities also. But like, for the most part, I think, like, to you know, second what Asaf was saying, this is where the power structure lies in large part, and Mari, in the Jewish community. And so this is like, so we pay more attention to it at Jewish publications. And I mean, I think, like, you know, there have been just a succession of reporters, and I think there are more and more now, thankfully, at Jewish publications that know how to read 990s and know where to look and know what to look at and what questions to ask to interrogate those things.
And it's worth just giving a shout out to Josh Nathan Kazis, who was a reporter covering philanthropy at the Forward newspaper for maybe 10 years. And I think he really created a base of knowledge and like a baseline of knowledge about this topic that we're all working off of, I'd say. I would argue that the mainstream press covers Jewish philanthropists all the time. Whether it's Steinhardt or it's the Sacklers or it's Bloomberg or it's all these big names. And that's only because Jews are very active in philanthropy, and they're very, very, they're overrepresented on the list that the Chronicle of Philanthropy puts together and Forbes puts together of big Jewish donors, and because they donate to universities and hospitals and humanitarian aid and all those topics. But where I do totally see what both Mari and Ben are saying is that their Jewishness is often downplayed. And I do think that represents an anxiety that people have about not falling into anti-Semitic tropes and not wanting to be seen as writing about this person because they are Jewish and it has to do with money. And so, yeah, I definitely recognize the reticence that you were talking about, Mari.
Are there any standout reporters that you follow that you think are doing a good job? We heard a lot of New York examples, and I'm wondering if you have some others across the country.
I mean, David Farenthold, I guess that's I don't know how to say his last name, but I guess that's he was reporting out of Washington, D.C., and he does a lot of non-New York stories, but he pops up as like someone who's doing amazing.
His entire beat is about nonprofit accountability now, so
right.
He's definitely interesting to cover. Great. I want to return to the idea of the tropes a little later in the conversation, but one of the things that really struck me when I asked you all what was important about talking about this issue, I think, if you could have used, the biggest letters possible, you all said transparency. And that is a challenge in all of philanthropy. There's a lot of things that don't have to be disclosed by law, although a few things do, but it is something different about Jewish philanthropy that when we're dealing with congregations or other kinds of things, there's even less disclosure. Some of it also has to do with just people wanting to protect their organizations and that kind of thing. So I was wondering if you could talk about that issue and how it affects you as reporters. And then I'd really like to hear how you get around that challenge, because of course, none of the stories that you produce would be possible if nobody said anything and you weren't able to find anything on the record. So who wants to start off on that conversation about transparency of both nonprofits and donors?
I mean, I'd be glad to. I mean, honestly, the first example of like how you get around lack of transparency, I think of Mari's reporting with Alex Kane and involving obtaining sources from within the Anti-Defamation League to reveal the inner workings of that organization. Every time, I think there's been like 2 big stories like that over the past couple of years, and in both cases, I'm like, oh, I wish I would have gotten that. How did you cultivate those sources? But about the lack of transparency, I think, I think a lot of the Jewish world is religious, right? So they don't have the same filing requirements that a regular nonprofit would have. Wait, did you want me to kind of speak to what the barriers are?
Yeah, I'd love to be specific.
So I think synagogue doesn't have to file its tax return publicly. So I have no idea what's happening with that. And then organizations are increasingly defining themselves as religious and then exempting themselves from reporting. So that is a huge problem. There are untold billions of dollars flowing, and we just have no sense of them whatsoever. Other trends that we're seeing is the use of donor advised funds, which allow foundations and other types of nonprofits to donate money without telling anyone who they're donating to. And then even the rise of LLC donations. So a lot of philanthropists are increasingly choosing to a less tax advantageous vehicle to donate through, just to protect their just to avoid any transparency. So which is kind of an odd behavior for like we're not used to in billionaires, right? That they're willing to take a tax hit. I guess that the being secretive part is pretty common, but
you can have a foundation under an LLC, so they're actually probably not sacrificing the tax.
Oh, I guess you're right. Yeah, I didn't even realize that. Yeah. So I've been meaning to talk to an expert accountant to explain all the ins and outs of that. That's important, actually. We just said, okay. And I think my way of that I'm increasingly trying to get around it is through the use of data. So the IRS has finally, in the year 2022, increasingly compelling nonprofits, the subset of nonprofits that are required to file tax returns, to file them digitally, right? Some of them still are filing paper things where they're writing by hand, but we're getting more increasingly they're digitized, even though we're like a couple years behind. We can't get the most recent filings. Huge problems with how the IRS, the actual IRS rules, and then the utter lack of any ability or desire by the IRS to enforce laws around reporting requirements. So with that said, we do have increased body of data from these tax filings, and I'm looking at ways to mine that data for stories. And while I was doing that last year, I stumbled upon a donation that no one had noticed. Biggest donation that the Chabad Lubavitch, the biggest known donation, or biggest donation reported to the IRS that the Chabad Lubavitch movement had ever received. Probably need to qualify that, but a very, very big donation. And it came from Jan Koum, the founder of WhatsApp, who's worth $13 billion according to Forbes's best guess. And that sent me down a rabbit hole, and I was able to figure out that he actually is as big a donor as any in the Jewish world today, even though no one aside from his grantees had any clue that he's donating to Jewish causes now. So that story really revealed a new power center, and we're able to look at like what his priorities are and glean the impact on our discourse and on our communal kind of direction.
Yeah, that was a really important one, and I'm glad to hear how it came into being. That's an excellent example. Mari, would you like to add in some thoughts?
Sure, and I appreciate Asaf shouting out my colleague Alex and my reporting. I would say it's a real challenge, and for every piece that we write where we get a leak from the Anti-Defamation League from inside, I would say there's about 10 more where none of the sources will talk to us, or where we really can't get anything from in there. And so it's a real challenge, and I think that extends to reporting on other Jewish institutions and on Jewish philanthropies. For example, when I was working on a piece about the history of the field of Israel studies, I was really hoping to get some more information from the Schusterman Foundation, who's been a major funder of Israel studies programs. And particularly, there had been kind of a shift in their strategy. They had funded for a really long time one organization called the, I think, American Israeli Cooperative Enterprise that was doing a lot of the Israel studies work. And then later they kind of created this new organization called the Israel Institute. And I was really interested in like why they had made that shift. And, you know, I sent them a bunch of detailed questions, and I would really, you know, I couldn't get an interview with anybody. I could only get, you know, a generic statement. And I was trying to find people maybe who had worked there before, and just really no way in for me on that. And so I think that's something we come up against a lot. In this case, you know, I was able to talk to people at the other organizations and get their perspective on their work with the Schusterman Foundation, and was lucky that, you know, one of the people who had been involved in the work talked to me a lot about what he had done. So, you know, there's ways around it in terms of what sources you can talk to, what relationships you can develop, but it's definitely, I think, pretty challenging and frustrating that a lot of these big foundations don't really feel a responsibility to talk very candidly to the press, which is not surprising, but frustrating for sure. I think as well, you know, the issues with documentation in the IRS that Asaf talks about are really relevant and frustrating. I don't spend quite as much time rooting around in there as I think Asaf does, and probably Ben has done as well. But I think that, you know, it's something that it's frustrating to see, you know, what has to be redacted from a lot of those forms, you know, who's exempted, you know, can make it really hard to find things. I know that my colleague Alex Kane has had some luck. He was able to, you know, some of the online search tools, especially the one that ProPublica maintains, can be really helpful. My colleague Alex Kane was able to discover one of the funders of Canary Mission, this like online kind of blacklist of pro-Palestine activists that has like had a very secretive provenance and funders. And he was able to find one of them simply by like searching for a name in the ProPublica 990s database. And so he broke a story that way. And so I think a lot of it is just kind of like getting in the data and searching and like keeping up with it. I also used that for my story on Morningstar and JLens. I used those documents to learn a little bit more about where JLens had gotten its funding. But definitely, you know, it would be really nice to see those transparency laws enforced more.
Yes, it would. And I think that's why as reporters, we have to keep encouraging that as much as we can, because if we don't report it to the IRS, they won't necessarily know what's going on. Not that that will solve it all, but I think it does make a difference when we talk about it. Ben, what would you like to say about that issue?
So I mean, all of that is true regarding 990s and lack of transparency on that front. And like I remember there was an interview I was doing at Jewish Philanthropy a while ago, where this new organization was being founded, and a question I would ask for every single article I did was, you know, what's your organizational budget, right? What's your annual budget? And this person like wasn't telling me. And I was like, look, at a certain point, I can just look at your 990 and like get the number, right? You know, what, right? And they're like, oh yeah, but that won't come out for 2 more years, right? So I mean, I got the number anyway, but you know, that's definitely something people lean on to hide their numbers, and like even at a more basic level, like writing about, like, let's say a large donation to a museum or something like that, right? There's this impulse, even when they're trying to like announce these things and get publicity for them, to like, I can't tell you how many pitches I've gotten for things like that, where they don't name the donor or the amount donated. And it's like, I'm not going to cover that. I don't know anything about what's actually happening here. And so like even getting the most basic information about philanthropic gifts can sometimes be a struggle. And so that's an impulse that I've tried to, fight against in reporting on it.
We face that same problem, as you can imagine. And so if there are people who do communications following this chat, I hope you'll think about the ways to try to get more information. It's very hard to know whether something's worth covering without some of those very basics. And yet that is a frequent thing that happens. I'd love to hear from all of you about the stories that you think aren't getting covered that need more attention. But before I do that, we were getting some great questions in the chat. Please, audience members, we'd love to hear from you. We'll start the Q&A section in a little bit, so keep those coming. But what are the things that you wish were getting more coverage? What are the hot topics that need to be covered? Or that you'd like to cover and you don't have enough time to cover?
I think you're asking us to give away stories.
Yes, hardly, but
yeah, I mean, yeah, go ahead, Asaf.
I know if you knew, if you know, go for it. I need to think about it a little bit more.
Yeah, I think this is a hard one, especially because I think that there's obviously a question of giving away stories, and also the fact that there's so much that I know that I really think that Asaf and Ben at JTA do a great job covering a lot of news. But I think, one thing that I'm kind of interested in is this question of like donor advised funds and the political limits that are imposed on donors in the Jewish community. I know that my colleague Alex has written a little bit about, for example, a funder who wanted to give to the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem had the Seattle Jewish Community Fund basically wouldn't allow that funder to give to B'Tselem because they had put out a report accusing Israel of practicing apartheid. And that's like not the first time that there's been sort of a political red line there. But then there's this question, certain advocacy groups have kind of put out reports about whether some of these donor advised funds have had far fewer red lines when it comes to giving donors giving to organizations on the right, and even organizations that have participated in perpetuating anti-Muslim sentiment. And I know that JTA has done some of the coverage of reports that have come out about that from groups like CARE, but I think it would be really interesting to kind of like, dig more into some of the donor advised fund politics of, where what's allowed and what's not, and thinking more about that is something I'm personally interested in. And so I think that's definitely like a story that's worth keeping an eye on, and really kind of just mirrors some of these broader questions around, where the politics of the Jewish community are writ large versus like the politics of who's representing them. I'm also just really interested to see, and I know that Ben has written a little bit about this, but basically, with some of the changes with the Israeli government, and a lot of, we're seeing more American Jewish communal protest of the government's actions, what's that going to look like for American Jewish philanthropy? Because there is a lot of, philanthropic money that goes to supporting programming in Israel. And I know that even Miriam Adelson, the widow of major Jewish birthright donor Sheldon Adelson, has spoken out against Israel's judicial reform. And so that's like a pretty major change to kind of speak out critically in that way. And so I'm really interested in seeing like what stories are going to develop around that.
Yeah, exactly. That actually is a perfect segue, because I've been texting the past few days with the head of the Adelson Family Foundation and making asking to interview him, or Miriam Adelson saying, hey, Sheldon, it's been a while now since Sheldon Adelson has died. This is a very important power center and a center of philanthropy in the Jewish world. What direction are you taking things? Is anything changing? Or if anything's staying the same, like people want to know. And I don't think that is such a crazy question to ask, but I think, or such an intrusive question to ask, like what happens now after the founder died? And yet that I think is worth covering. So if you can figure out that story, anyone is welcome to do it, because I'm still stuck on that. I also think that another thing Mari was talked about is, there is this perception, and I tend to think it's true, that there's a distance between the politics of the funding class and the politics of the overall Jewish community. Now, is that a problem? I think the problem's a little more complicated than it would seem. And why is that? What does that mean? It's a very hard thing to cover, because pointing that out is not enough, even if we can kind of point it out in a more in a quantitative way. I'm not sure how we would, but I think pointing it out is not enough. We have to understand how those tensions manifest and where they lead us. And the other thing that comes to mind that all of us kind of are vested in perhaps vested in not covering is the ownership of the ownership of the Jewish press, of Jewish media. There's a lot of Jewish outlets, both in Israel. They cover the American Jewish world, even though they're in Israel, and in the United States itself. And it's actually, we're getting a lot of them. They're growing and multiplying. And I know I've tried to figure out who owns what, and it's unclear in a lot of cases. So that's a tricky one for any of us to report.
Really tricky one, yeah. Can you talk more though about that a little bit? And have you seen pressures from donors because of that ownership? Is that changing how the press operates? Well, I have seen things that are odd and things that raise eyebrows, but probably not anything where I could come out and say, oh, I'd have to report it out. Yes. I wouldn't want to put anyone on the spot without actually knowing the full story. But certainly, as we see the rise, of nonprofit news organizations in general, and full disclosure, we are about to become one. It is an issue of, where the funding is going and how is that influencing the priorities of the press, in addition to everything else. And we're all going to have very strong integrity principles. Ben, I wonder if you'd like to weigh in on this topic.
On the topic of ownership of the Jewish press?
No, we started on the issues that aren't getting as much attention as perhaps.
Oh yeah. So look, just to speak briefly on that, I am pro transparency in all things. But in terms of topics that don't get enough attention or that I think deserve more attention, there are two things that kind of have come to mind, which is, one, there was this huge influx of Jewish aid money for Ukrainian refugees, and organizations working around the crisis that the Russian invasion has spurred, and like hundreds of millions of dollars. And I'd like to know, like there was a lot of coverage of that funding and that philanthropy, and I haven't seen a lot of follow-up on it, in terms of like effectiveness. There were a lot of donor delegations to Ukraine that proved kind of controversial. We did a little bit of reporting on that at Jewish Philanthropy, but I'd like to see more of that. I want to see how how that money, how the redirection of that money has affected kind of the broader landscape of American Jewish philanthropy. And the second thing, and this is one of the broadest topics possible, but crypto isn't going away, even with SBF's arrest, Sam Bankman-Fried's arrest, and the crash in crypto value that happened over the past year. But everyone I've talked about this says yes, for people in that space, things haven't been good, but it's not like it's going to go away as a vehicle for value and finance. And so I think that there needs to be a lot more examination of how that's going to impact the philanthropic world in general and Jewish philanthropy in particular.
Those are all really important topics. We talked briefly toward the beginning of the conversation about why the rest of the press maybe doesn't cover some of these issues, and you attributed it to squeamishness and concern about the tropes about Jews and money, which I think is a really relevant issue. I'm curious how you deal with that in your own reporting. How do you avoid that? How do you think about it? Does that come up in the editing process as well as the reporting process? Could each of you talk a little bit about how you handle that?
I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. I think my number one advice, or just, mantra on this topic would just be to be normal. I don't think it's such a tall, it's just, I think it's a question of reporting what happens, reporting accurately, not relying on any sort of fanciful understandings or tropes or, ways to describe Jewish people. Just I think if reporters take on these stories and approach them as regular stories, I think that's definitely, it's doable. And so I think just trying to be normal about it, which obviously some people do have trouble with, goes a long way. I think for me, one thing I like to think about in my work is to just, make it clear that these issues aren't limited only to the Jewish community. And I think that goes a long way too. I mean, obviously, I write for Jewish Currents. we're going to focus on Jewish issues. Sometimes we even get criticism for saying, why do you only criticize things when the Jews are doing it? And it's, if I worked for a different publication, we would be focusing on something else. And I think that that's just part of our mandate. But I do think it is important to draw lines, when to make it clear when these are broader issues. So for example, when I was working on the Israel studies piece, I included a small section about the way in which the, this question of philanthropic interest in a certain academic subject, the way that that affects academic freedom. This is not just a problem with Israel studies and some of these Jewish donors, but this is a problem with academia in general, with the defunding of academia and kind of decline in state and public funding and rise of donor influence. And so I, spent some time talking about the ways in which that has played out, both in other disciplines in general, like economics, and also other area studies, Middle East studies, maybe like Turkish studies. And so I think it really helps when it's relevant in the story to draw connections to the other ways in which this plays out that isn't just, about, Jewish money and Jewish donors, because I think that it does help make it more clear that this isn't like an anti-Semitic perspective. I also think it's on us as well to be responsible in our reporting about anti-Semitism and not to contribute to this idea that simply writing about Jewish donors is an act of anti-Semitism. I think it's been kind of disappointing to see, for example, that some of the great reporting that Ben cited that the New York Times has done about, yeshiva education and some of the problems there has received a lot of backlash, not just from the community written about, but also from some other organizations and publications and even the Anti-Defamation League. It's kind of been accused of anti-Semitism. And I think that's really disappointing to see because I think it's really good reporting that was done really diligently and carefully. And, I didn't find it to be anti-Semitic. And I don't think that's like a substantive criticism of the reporting. And so I think that it's frustrating also because it does dilute these important conversations about anti-Semitism to have. And so I think that part of our role as journalists is to, write about those anti-Semitism issues responsibly as well.
Good guidance.
Yeah, I think we have to just do good journalism and write responsibly. And I think that ultimately there is no foolproof defense against your work being kind of misused and abused by bad faith actors, especially in the era of the internet, where something innocuous can be turned into the appearance of something nefarious. So I don't think, I think worrying about it too much to the point where it's paralyzing you is just, I wouldn't do that. And I think actually the person who wrote the book on Jews and money is right here on panel with us, Lila Cohen Berman. And if for anyone who wants like a primer about how to think about this issue, I remember reading her book right as I started covering philanthropy at JTA, and there is like a really interesting section, like part of an essay, I think, either in the introduction or in the end, I can't remember exactly where, about how she approaches this problem. And so I think that's a good resource for folks to read. I think she has, it's just, yeah.
Good. Ben?
Yeah, I agree with the need for responsibility and accuracy in reporting. And I think like the answer here, on this topic and like any contentious topic is almost never to not report. In other words, like you should, the times when you say, I'm not going to do this story because I'm worried about what might happen or like the way it might come out, those times should be very rare. If you have questions and you have doubts and you're worried that it plays into tropes, that is a time for more reporting to me. That's a time to be asking more questions or talking to a source or many sources, right? So like, if I mean, I think, Mari, you were kind of talking about like not taking things at face value, which is something that I also try to not do. And like, I think that a lot of it is like, okay, you see a study from one organization or another, or like a, a measure of anti-Semitism or something, right? Try not to take it at face value. Ask the questions. If you can't ask the questions, or I mean, if you can't get answers, then reflect that in the reporting. But I think like, if we're at a point where we're saying we're not going to touch this thing because we're afraid of like what we're going to have to write, then that's generally the wrong answer.
Thank you for all having such thoughtful answers to that. I think that will help people understand how you do your work, which I think the more transparent we are too as journalists about how we do what we do, the more we can reassure everybody that we are being careful, and also that we're not racing in with things without the context that you've all talked about so much. I'd love to turn to the audience's questions because there are quite a few coming in. Continue to keep them coming, audience members, but let me read a couple of them to you. The first question is, are there any models emerging to protect Jewish media outlets covering philanthropy from the impact of their reporting on their own financial survival? It seems far-fetched to imagine a model that allows for independence from philanthropy, but is there anything aiming in that direction? We talked a little bit about that when we were talking about ownership, but I'm wondering if you want to talk more about that issue and whether any of you have experienced it.
I know of no model like that. I think the only reporting that is insulated from philanthropy, the reports on Jewish philanthropy, it would be Israeli publications that are commercial publications and have totally other revenue streams, but decide to devote some attention to these issues. So that's all I can think about.
I mean, I would just add to that like for-profit newspapers are also subject to these pressures in different ways. Everyone is subject to conflicts of interest and financial pressures from owners or from advertisers or whatever, and that's absolutely not to excuse any kind of compromise on any of those things. I think that Asaf is absolutely right that like the best defense against those kinds of pressures is insulation and really just a news culture and a culture of support for good journalism at publications.
There's go ahead, Mari, sorry.
Yeah, I think one thing that has been helpful, I agree that it's a challenge that faces all news outlets, especially as we're just moving into this world in which nonprofit news often is like the best model for survival. But also, again, that this isn't something that for-profit outlets are insulated from. There is an organization called the Institute for Nonprofit News, which Jewish Currents is a member of, and which previous nonprofit outlets I've worked with have been a member of, and they do provide some resources, and they, we worked with them, I believe, on a statement on editorial independence and transparency, and they kind of can help publications like create standards for creating a wall between the editorial side and the business side to avoid being unduly influenced by donors. And so I think that that's something that can be helpful. I can drop ours in the chat if people are interested in looking at it. I think for outlets to collaborate with each other on sharing strategies about this stuff is useful. I think transparency is great. So listing funders online and also disclosing whenever maybe a funder mentioned a story is also a funder of an outlet. And then the other thing I would say is, my advice to some journalists who are dealing with this would also be to unionize, because I think that if there, obviously there's other questions there. It's not completely directly relevant, but I think for us being in a union as a staff, especially as an editorial staff, kind of gives us a voice and power in the organization to making sure that we're can speak up in favor of our editorial integrity. And it gives us a voice as well, like, gives us an ability to attend board of directors meetings and make sure that, we can understand what's going on so that we can, avoid any pressures on our editorial work. And I think that so far we've been really lucky that has not been a big problem with our funders, but it's nice to know that that is an option that our staff have.
And I'd like the audience to know that the Jewish Currents, JTA, and the Forward are all unionized, and I don't think anyone else is. So I might be, correct me if I'm wrong.
That's really important. And there's a big trend at all nonprofits to have much more unionization. But interesting before there was a union, did you not feel you could weigh in on these issues of integrity with the donors?
No, I definitely think that we felt that we could, especially Jewish Currents is a pretty small newsroom that has a pretty democratic editorial structure. So there definitely was an opportunity. But I think that the union really created a more official structure to make sure that that happened. Because I think beforehand, it was just like, people working together to put out, there's a lot of stuff to do. It wasn't always, just getting all the information about what was going on to the whole staff. Sometimes that fell by the wayside when other things were going on. And now that we have a union representative, I think that really helps just make sure that it's an automatic part of the process. But I do think that, I wouldn't say it was like a major problem before or anything.
No, but it's very interesting to think about how that changes the dynamics. Fascinating. Okay. Please add.
I had something to add. Just that Yuda Kurtzer, who's kind of a big voice in the Jewish community, public intellectual style guy, he has been calling for a few years now for a Jewish ProPublica because he's very concerned about this issue. And for those who don't know, ProPublica is the premier nonprofit investigative newsroom in the country. Very, very big operation. And I know that their theory of this issue, I mean, they're a nonprofit that depend on donations, but their theory of how to balance those pressures is to diversify their donor pool to get as many small donations as possible, so that one donor won't be able to, okay, you're not interested, bye-bye, like we don't need you. No one will feel like they have too much leverage over the newsroom. Yeah,
exactly. Which is the same rule, obviously, we all feel with advertising. If it's diversified, it's very easy to say, no, we won't take it. So that's really critical. Ben, did you want to?
I just want to second. I just want to second the importance of disclosure in news articles. I know Mari mentioned that. I whenever I read a news article and I see it at JTA, we try to insist on it in to be very stringent about putting it in, and I love seeing it in other newsrooms as well, because to me it's not only like a sign when you see that parenthetical in the article that X, disclosing whatever connection the subject of the article has to the organization, but it's also a sign to me that I can trust that publication more broadly about these issues, and that I know that they take it seriously. So when for people that are readers of news as we are, when you see that, try to take that as a signal that this is something that the journalists are thinking about.
That's a great suggestion, helping everybody also understand how to decide where to trust. I'm glad for that advice. Let's turn to another question. In his book, Public Opinion, Walter Lippmann wrote that newspapers respond to their audiences and what they cover and how they cover it. We have just seen an extreme example of that in the revelations about Fox News. But how do the interests and generally progressive politics of Jewish audiences affect the work of Jewish media?
I'll jump in on that. So I mean, it's no secret, and surveys are quite clear that the majority of Jewish Americans hold views that would be in American kind of political classification called liberal or progressive, or definitely Democratic leaning. I will say that a lot of engaged Jewish I wonder what the breakdown is in terms of the most engaged readers of Jewish news. I'm not sure how how that general split maps onto the most engaged readers. And of course, of our publications generally, everyone's different. Like I would imagine that, the breakdown of the political affiliations of Jewish Currents readers aren't the same as JTA readers, right? Or the Forward or Jewish Insider or whatever, right? So I think for everyone it's different. Obviously, we all get our version of letters to the editor or comments or in Facebook comments or whatever, right? And just more broadly, just the only thing I would say is that we try to keep in mind and correct for biases more generally, but what we hear from our engaged readership doesn't necessarily map on exactly to what we know about the general political preferences and leanings of American Jewry writ large.
Yeah, and I think that it's obviously somewhat different for the mandate for JTA as this kind of broader Jewish news organization versus Jewish Currents, which is kind of explicitly identified as a leftist Jewish magazine, although we do try to speak to a very broad audience. I think in some ways this question is part of what prompted the sort of revival of Jewish Currents that happened about 5 years ago to kind of with younger staff was really noticing that there was this rising Jewish left movement and that there kind of wasn't an outlet that was really designed to speak directly to a lot of those concerns. And so that's really what kind of motivated the Jewish Currents work and what has. But yeah, I do think in general, some of, just trying to be accurate. And, there's always this question of to what extent are you responding to your audience's feedback versus to what extent are you putting something in front of your audience and sort of leading them in a certain direction. And it's, always an interesting thing to think about in balance. One thing that I've think has been really great that we've been able to do at Jewish Currents is to publish a lot of the letters to the editor that we get. We actually do that pretty frequently where we put that up. We put them up on our site and then can kind of start a discussion around different articles. And we often get a lot of really interesting and thoughtful letters, and it really enriches the intellectual discussion and political discussion that we're able to have. And so that's something that I think has worked well.
It's a great recommendation, and let me also urge everybody in the audience to write those letters. We get a lot of them too, and they're some of the best read kinds of things that we all have, and it really is a chance for the audience to engage. So I love the fact that people haven't stopped writing letters to the editor, even in the digital age. Asaf, did you want to add to the discussion?
No, I mean, it's hard to tell how our own biases are affecting us. I think it's a complicated problem. I think we try to do our best. Everyone I work with at JTA is an honest person with integrity, and I think we just do our best. And I think it goes back to just the practices of journalism, just the basics. You have to do it right.
I remember hearing a lecture by a prominent journalist a long time ago, who said I'm a journalist who covers Israel. I don't have an opinion. And it's that's a lie. They're either they were either lying to themselves or lying to the audience knowingly. If you have any modicum of knowledge about anything, you naturally form an opinion about it. And like Asaf said, the challenge and the mandate is for us at JTA at least is to try to keep to have integrity, to try to keep that out of the reporting and follow where the reporting leads, regardless of what you might think. But people have opinions and reporters are people, and so the idea that we don't have opinions or we don't have biases isn't true. And again, the idea is to recognize them and work with that in the picture. You know what I mean?
Exactly. That's a really important thing. That's why there are usually multiple people involved in the process too, before anything gets published. Editors are looking at it. If there's a controversial thing, there are other journalists weighing in to make sure that all of us are being rigorous in our own reporting. Mari, you wanted to say something, I think.
Oh yeah, I just think it's great that Ben mentioned that. I think that's really important. And I would say that that's a topic that's being discussed, I think, increasingly in journalism in recent years. I think as in some ways as part of the broader field of journalism's sort of soul searching and, questions and agitations and movements to kind of, become more diverse, become more responsible to different communities, to tackle some histories of, racism and other types of exclusion. I think that there have been a lot of questions about what it really means to be objective, and whether we can really think about this model of the objective, unopinionated journalist, especially because, to what extent is that model often mean maybe a white man? And so I think that actually is something that has been increasingly a question, and there's been a lot of interesting work on that, especially that this idea of a objective individual with no opinion is like, when you think about it historically, that's actually only been the model for a journalist for like a pretty short period of time in American history. Yeah, I'm glad that Ben brought that up, and I think it's great that there's been more discussion about that.
That's great context. You're right. It hasn't been for very long that we've had this tradition of the so-called objective, and who is that objective person? I'm going to ask you another question from the audience. Ben mentioning Ukraine made me think about how much Jewish fundraising is crisis-oriented. Anti-Semitism, terrorism in Israel, Jews in Ukraine, the Soviet Union, Jews in Ethiopia, even Holocaust remembrance can be framed in this crisis mode. At the same time, there's an explosion of creative Judaism outside of connection to the Federation and philanthropic worlds, instead arising out of contemporary spiritual, social values, political interests. Can reporting on Jews and money somehow highlight the new trends away from crisis and highlighting contemporary creativity? A lot packed into that question.
I mean, I think it's absolutely essential that we cover what's happening outside of the traditional denominations or institutions. I mean, it's, that's clearly where a lot of the direction, that's clearly one of the trends, and we can't miss that. It's a little harder. Lack of institutions, it makes it a little harder to cover. It's hard to tell. There's no baseline of knowledge. There's no kind of traditional expertise to lean on. I think that yeah, and I think that that's not really usually my role at the organization, but I think we have a lot of reporters who are really dedicated to that.
And I'm not sure if how much this answers the question, but I will say that aside from the year I was at Jewish Philanthropy, I've been, again, like about a decade, maybe a little more, at JTA in total. And during that time, even, our reporting has become less organizationally focused. So like, we're very much paying attention to what the organizations are doing. We've got good reporting on that. But that's not like the exclusive focus anymore. And we're trying to look at, in addition to that, like the broad spectrum of just how Jews are living their lives and what they prioritize and how they express their Judaism in their lives, which could be a thousand different things, which I think is exciting as a journalist. So yeah, just in terms of like how that relates to crisis and stuff. I don't think covering crisis and creativity are mutually exclusive. I also think that creativity sometimes comes out of crisis. This is very tangential, but there was a great article in the New Yorker like a couple of years ago about how Black Death fostered this huge explosion of creativity in Europe, and how the pandemic might be doing the same thing in the United States, or I mean across the world rather. And like, and you can also think about the Jewish world the same way, that like the Soviet Jewry movement and even what's going, the response to Ukraine right now, I think, might, I don't want to predict anything, but that is creating a new landscape, and that could lead to things, right? So to put it in the most general terms possible, right? So that's something we definitely want to pay attention to.
Yes. Mari, did you want to add anything?
Sure. Yeah, I think I think what Asaf and Ben have both said is great. I think it's a great question. I know that this is something that is a important issue. I think a few years ago, Jewish Currents contributing editor Maya Ip, who was like one of the founding cultural editors of the publication, wrote a really interesting report that I can share with you all about some of the frustrations with feeling like there wasn't enough philanthropic resources focused on fostering really exciting Jewish creativity in the art world, and that a lot of those resources have been diverted elsewhere. And so I think that is something that's like worth thinking about and reporting on. And again, is the sort of thing, reporting that would benefit from us having more transparency sometimes about where some of these funds go. Although obviously the existing reporting is really helpful. And I think, yeah, for us, I know it's always a tension about, where are we putting our reporting? Are we focusing on like the exciting these exciting new initiatives, or are we focusing on, kind of burrowing into these powerful existing things that are bigger? And it's definitely always a balance there. But I do think it is, heartening that, outlets like JTA are moving in the direction of covering these things.
It's really important. And when we were talking about the stories that haven't been covered as much, I think we'll all be talking about the ways that pandemic transformed organizations. We certainly saw a lot of turn to mutual aid and all of those kinds of things. We don't have the distance yet to do it. But one of the stories I know we're reporting on is just the fiscal cliff that seems to be coming for many organizations. So, now that government aid has dried up, how is that going to change things and change demand and all of those kinds of things? So I think we're all going to be writing about crisis in a different way very soon. We have to wrap up fairly quickly, and I was curious if each of you wanted to add one observation about something we haven't covered, or reinforce something that you already said, and also if there's anything you'd love people in the audience to reach out to you with, if there are things that would be helpful to you in your reporting, why don't you suggest that specifically? And if you're comfortable sharing your email addresses so that they can write you, I think that would be fantastic too. So let me start with Ben.
So I mean, this probably sounds like a little bit of a platitude, because it probably is a little bit of a platitude. But I just want to say that, like, I want to give strength to everyone doing Jewish journalism and trying to do a good job with Jewish journalism, because it's a small world, and there's a lot of money to be covered and a lot of power structures to be covered. And I think what's been happening over the past few years in that space has been really exciting. So I please read us, please read Jewish Currents and the Forward and the rest of the publications, because I know that there's a lot of scrutiny of the reporting and stuff, and I think that there's just a good core of journalists trying to do an honest, good job with this stuff. So thank you for reading us, and thanks for having us on this panel.
Asaf?
I think like our reporting is often as good as our sources. So I would encourage you to talk to us and not just look at the media, and not just think of the media as a hegemonic or just like this nebulous thing. Like, I want to hear from people. I know I get things wrong. I know that you all know a lot more about the things happening in your life than I will know. So yeah, I'd like to cultivate. I'd like to find a way to cultivate a civic spirit of cooperation between the public and Jewish journalists, and and whether with ordinary people who are news consumers or people who are decision makers, and for some reason feel very little need to talk to the public about what they do.
That's a great point. We are only as good as the people who are willing to help us be more accurate, whether they're quoted or not quoted. We do a lot to run stories by experts and make sure we've gotten it right, but sometimes people shy away from that. So you're absolutely important. We need to find more mechanisms for that. Mari?
Yeah, it's been great to get to be part of this conversation, and really appreciate the reporting that's done by Stacy and Ben and Asaf and all these outlets. I really do think in journalism also there is, obviously we compete for scoops and that sort of thing, but I do think none of us could do it alone, and we really do need multiple strong outlets and voices in this area. And it's great that that is something that's being done by everybody here, and it's really great that so many people attended and are interested in a conversation like this. I dropped my email in the chat and would definitely love to hear from anybody. I think some of the stuff I talked about earlier, people who have worked with certain Jewish foundations or philanthropy, I'm always interested in learning more about, what people are thinking about inside, what's going on there. So definitely would welcome, hearing from anyone who might want to talk about that, but also anyone who has any feedback or thoughts, always open to hearing from you. So definitely feel free to shoot me a note.
That's terrific. And thank you for a wonderful conversation, Ben, Asaf, and Mari. It's been a delight to talk to you. Audience members, keep reading these folks. They're doing absolutely tremendous work, as are all the colleagues that they mentioned. Let me turn it back to Lila.
I just have very quick words of thanks to say to Steve for so able just before. And I think that one of the things I picked up, and I just want to flag for everyone, is how important it is Mari and Ben and Asaf and Stacy, we got some tips about how to do that. So I'm going to take those to heart, and I hope that the rest of you who are on this Zoom and will do the same. This will be posted eventually in on the YouTube channel through the CAT Center. And we're just so grateful to all of the panelists and to Stacy and to all of the audience who came and participated. So thank you so much.